up and sit down.
Hello, my name is Miss Janessa J. Champagne, and I am super excited to welcome you to our first ever very special episode of Janessa After Dark. Now, if you are not a child of the 80s or even the early 90s, you might be like, I don't know what a very special episode is. Now, a very special episode is when a generally lighthearted, fun, not very serious comedy would have an episode or sometimes even a two-part episode where they would tackle hard-hitting social issues. Or at least content that was a little bit more serious than their typical fare. In particular, I remember one of the first very special episodes that I ever saw was The Facts of Life, and Blair was researching her family history and found that some of the people in her family used to own slaves. So how did she react to this news? By being really nice to Tootie. It was just as awkward and cringy as it sounds. But it was a chance for that show to at least attempt to try to tackle this country's history of racism. Some shows had episodes about child molesters, or drug abuse, or domestic violence, and Punky Brewster even had an episode telling kids not to play hide and seek in old appliances. That's right, her friend Cherry played hide and seek and hid in an old refrigerator and almost died. Luckily, in school that day, they'd been learning how to do CPR, and Punky and friends were able to save the day. So what's a very special episode of Janessa After Dark? Well, we've got our typical format, which includes brief commentary followed by an interview with a specific person. And we've got our Sloppy Seconds episodes, which are a shorter episode where you get little snippets from the previous 3 interviews. But for this episode, I wanted to do something completely different. Now, the seed for this episode was planted a few months ago when we had the big controversial moment with RuPaul's Drag Race, where RuPaul said that he probably wouldn't have allowed contestant Peppermint onto the show if she had already been presenting herself as a woman. Now, Peppermint is a drag performer, and she does identify as trans as well. And this gaffe from one of the world's most recognizable drag performers led to a rather interesting discussion about gender identity and the performance of gender through the art of drag. And I think that it's one of the first times that people started to see and understand that drag performers have all different kinds of gender identities and relationships to gender, and different ways that their own gender identity may or may not impact the persona that they bring to the stage. Now, I myself have a somewhat complicated relationship to gender identity and gender performance, which I'll get to more a little bit later in the episode. But what I wanted to do was just sit down with some of the many drag queens that I've met over the years, some of those great performers that I've had the pleasure of performing with, or even just some that I've met through shows and other venues. And I just wanted to ask them about their gender identity and how their gender impacted their performances on stage, if at all. I was able to sit down with a total of 11 performers who represent a variety of different identities and even experience levels, some of them having done drag for only a couple of years and some having done drag for more than a couple of decades. And I asked them all the same series of questions just to get their feelings about the topic. And what I was most struck by was the variety of answers that I got. These 11 different people all have very different ways of thinking about their gender expression, and how their offstage life and their onstage persona interact or don't interact. And what I thought was particularly interesting was the fact that for some people, even if they named or described their gender identity the same as another performer, their thoughts on the other questions were often very different. Each of the performers had their own way of interpreting my questions, thinking about the different terms that were being used, and explaining how they created and crafted their persona and how that persona related to their gender. Sometimes things got a little bit off track, but I was absolutely fine with that. What was really most important to me wasn't about hearing a specific perspective or a specific type of answer, but rather letting these performers really just speak for themselves. One of the things that I find really disheartening in a lot of our queer communities is that often drag performers are dismissed or pushed to the side when questions about gender and gender identity are at the forefront. There's often an assumption that drag performers are always cisgender people, and attached to that cisgender people have nothing to say about or think about in terms of gender identity. Now, in episode 6 of this podcast, I talked about the fact that on a macro level, cisgender is a really useful word for talking about people whose gender identity generally lines up with the sex that they were assigned at birth. But when we get down to the individual level, when we get down to person interactions, it's not as useful. It's not a term that quite so easily encompasses all of the different journeys and experiences that were talked about by my 11 different guests or myself. And as I talked about in that previous episode, I think that by having cisgender leveled against people as a way to invalidate their perspective when talking about gender identity actually works against the best interests of trans people and gender non-conforming people. Because again, what it does is it treats cisgender as the default, as though being cisgender does not give you a gender identity. You only have a gender identity if you're somehow different from what's considered normative. And while I absolutely want to lift up the voices of trans and gender non-conforming people, I also think we need to make room for people to think about and talk about and experience their gender identity, even if they identify or are interpreted to be cisgender. The same way that we need to create an intellectual space for white people to understand that they have a racial identity, and that racial identity isn't entirely defined by the privileges that they have. So that's what I hope to do with this very special episode. I just wanted to give 11 people that I think are pretty fantastic the opportunity to just very briefly talk about and think about their experiences of gender, both on stage and off. I wanted to ask them questions that maybe hadn't been asked before, and I wanted to present those answers without any sort of commentary. There are people in this group that identify as trans, there are people in this group that identify as cisgender, and there are people in this group that identify as gender non-conforming or gender fluid. And at least for the purposes of this episode, I didn't want to privilege one performer's voice over another. I just wanted to ask them the questions and see what they thought. Now, before we get into the interviews, I should probably tell you a little bit more about me and my gender journey. Now, in the immortal words of Betty Davis from All About Eve, fasten your seatbelts. It's going to be a bumpy night. Growing up in Bowbells, North Dakota, I never managed to do gender very well. There seemed to be all of these rules about what boys could do, what girls could do, and I never got the rule book. And I never understood why there were things that I wanted to do that I wasn't allowed to do, and why there were things that I didn't want to do that I was expected to do. I didn't understand this strange division between boys and girls that everybody else seemed to understand so well and navigate so perfectly. When it came to toys, I had a very specific philosophy. Give them all to me. I wanted all the toys. I would play with anything. Sometimes Barbie would drive the Tonka dump truck, and G.I. Joe would ride into battle on My Little Pony and then have a tea party with strawberry shortcake. In kindergarten, we had this amazing dress-up closet. And I wanted to play with everything. I wanted to play with the fireman's outfit, and I wanted to play with the dress-up gowns. I didn't understand why I couldn't be all of it, why I couldn't try on everything to see which one would fit. It was made very clear to me very early that certain things were off limits to me. And as kids often do, my peers let me know about those things in some of the worst ways possible. I remember one time in kindergarten, I was so excited because I had a little blue suitcase of My Little Ponies, and I was so excited to show them off to the class. And so many of the kids in my class made fun of me. They made fun of the ponies, and they even made fun of my little blue suitcase. I'm sure it was something we got at a rummage sale or a thrift store, and it, like me, just wasn't up to their standards. I also remember that my kindergarten teacher, Mrs. McSpadden, stuck up for me, and she very sternly told those mean kids in my class that she didn't understand any reason why a little boy or a little girl couldn't be into horses. And those little moments of kindness, those unexpected allies that would step in at just the right moment, were so important to me on my gender journey. As I got older, I still didn't understand all of the rules and I still wasn't very good at them, but I got a little bit better at hiding it and playing along. And part of that hiding it was tied up in my own feelings of homophobia, fear of femininity, and shame. And so I didn't think about my gender identity for a long time. I focused on other things like being a good student, competing on our speech team, and I counted the days until graduation when I could finally leave that small-minded town behind and head to the big city of Grand Forks. Little did I know Grand Forks was just a slightly larger small town, but luckily I didn't figure that out until I'd already made a lot of the changes in my life that I needed to make. Now, once I got to college, I started encountering a lot of different types of people, and I started to find a group of people that I felt like I belonged with. And what was really important for that group, and what really I think formed a lot of my identity as a young adult, was that we were all very different. I came from a small town where everybody was very much the same, and so being different was something to be ashamed of. It was something to hide. And now I was finding this amazing friend group where everybody was celebrated for being different. During that time, I came out, and I also started playing around with gender. Through the honors program, I was able to research the history of LGBT communities, and through that research, I discovered the long and often complicated history that LGBT communities have with gender and sexuality and the way that those interact, the ways that they're separate. There are some people who will argue that gender identity and sexuality are two entirely different things. There are some people who will say that they are absolutely intimately connected. And I think that while they're not exactly the same thing, they always have a very complicated, interwoven relationship. Your gender identity is not the same as your sexuality, but much of our sexuality is tied up in things related to gender identity and gender presentation. So much of what we think about in terms of attraction and fantasy and desire is tied to gendered presentation. And that can express itself in a wide variety of different types of feelings and desires. And that's probably something for its own episode. But as I was discovering all of this, and as I was learning more about my sexuality and my sexual identity, I was also learning more about my gender identity. And I was learning more about the shame that I had packed up related to my gender identity, related to the femininity that I perceived at the core of my being. During this time, as I was working through all of this sexuality and this shame, I also decided to become a drag performer. I'd been playing around with gender for a little while. I'd been going and buying clearance dresses at Sears and cheap tinsel wigs at Spencer's. And I was kind of a party girl. I would just go to parties. I would probably drink a little bit too much. I would make people laugh, and we would just have a good time. Now, in December of 2001, I got to perform in my first show, and that really gave me a lot of focus to the gender exploration that I had been doing. Up to that point, it had just been sort of dressing up and trying to figure out who this sort of character was. The shows gave that character a purpose. I've always loved theater. I've performed in a lot of high school and community theater, and it started for me as just a way to push the types of performances I had been able to give and make them a little bit edgier, a little bit more reflective of the queerness that I felt inside. But as I went on, my performances in drag also became an opportunity for me to really explore and think about gender in my own life. I started thinking about all of the ways in which, even as a young child, I had really been drawn to femininity. And I started to allow myself to explore that in a way that was more than just for my stage persona. At one point, I even questioned whether or not I might be trans. And while I don't think that that is everybody's experience, I don't think that that's entirely uncommon for people who do drag on a pretty regular basis. You're playing with and experimenting and moving through gender so much of the time that it makes you really evaluate the role of gender in your life as a whole. Now, as I was working through that and as I was questioning my own identity of whether or not I was trans, I realized that if I was presenting as a woman in my everyday life, I would still just want to look like a big fucking drag queen. And that's the thing about drag queens, is that drag queens are playing with femininity, but they don't necessarily want to look like women. At least not the type of women that you see every day just walking walking down the street. The makeup, the costumes, the jewelry is so exaggerated. It's a type of over-the-top femininity that really only is seen in very extreme environments like drag shows, strip clubs, certain types of porn actresses, circus acts. It's places where gender and really any kind of presentation are taken to the extreme. Drag is really about exploring gender, and for me it was always about finding the limits of that femininity. So not stopping at a sort of everyday, practical kind of femininity, but really exploring something that had some depth and had some challenge to it. And that's why when I started hosting shows, it became part of my persona to pair that beautiful, glamorous, sexy femininity with filthy, trashy jokes and sex talk that were really kind of a strange juxtaposition. Here I was presenting this image of femininity while also saying and doing things that aren't allowed of many or most women in our culture. Women who are overtly sexual are chastised. They're slut-shamed. They're blamed if they become victims of sexual assault or sexual harassment. And my performance was a way for me to connect with that, to connect with the fact that we denigrate femininity, and yet in a way, because of its outsiderness, it has a certain power to it. And that as you push it further and further out, you can gain more and more of that power, and you can be more and more of a challenge to the people who don't respect femininity. That's probably something for another blog post, but it's important when I'm thinking about my gender identity, because what eventually happened is that when I was married and when I was really fighting off some of the darkest mental illness and depression that I have ever experienced in my life, I was keeping my drag persona and my offstage persona very much separate. And where my onstage persona was strong and confident, my offstage persona was crumbling. I was slowly dying. And so when my marriage ended and I finally got that kick in the ass that I needed to keep going and to push myself to develop and build my offstage persona just as much as my onstage persona, I realized that there were things about Janessa that I needed to have offstage as Chris. There were things that I needed to include, that I needed to incorporate. And one of those things was a certain degree of femininity. I've always been drawn to femininity. I'm not overly feminine, but I'm also not overly masculine. And because of all that shame that I carried around for all of those years, I had spent so much time repressing any of that femininity that I knew it was time to finally let it out and express it in ways that felt authentic. It wasn't about trying to be somebody's understanding of a feminine man or a masculine man. It was about playing with gender and being authentically myself. And so I found myself at sort of an odd place where I feel like my gender expression is not terribly normative, but I also feel like I'm not read by other people as being queer enough or gender non-conforming enough. And I think that's part of why I bristle so much when somebody else uses the term cisgender, referring to someone who has not chosen to self-identify that way. Because I recognize that there is a lot of femininity in how I present myself now. A lot of the accessories that I wear. I love a good scarf. For a while I was bringing brooches back. I'm not afraid to wear a shiny pendant. I'm much more mixed in terms of how I present myself, both in just my personal life and my professional life. And so when somebody refers to me as cisgender, I feel like they're taking away that part of myself that I took away from myself for so long, just because they feel that I'm not non-conforming enough for their definition of gender non-conforming. And so I've ended up in this place where I use queer to describe both my sexual orientation and also my gender identity. Because when I look around at what's portrayed when people say gender fluid or gender non-binary, I see a lot of great, brave, interesting people, but they don't feel familiar to me. I still feel like I'm looking for my crowd. I'm looking for my tribe. And that's okay. That's part of what this whole journey is about. It's about finding yourself and hopefully finding yourself in better shape than when you started off on the journey. It's about healing and growing. And that's where I am with all of this right now, is I'm still trying to figure it out, and I'm trying to give myself the permission to really feel my way through it and to heal that child inside of me who never felt like they had permission to be their authentic self. right, that's enough about me. I promised you some great interviews, and we are going to get to those right now. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to go ahead and let each of the performers identify themselves with their drag name and how long they've been doing drag, and then I'll go ahead and insert the question followed by all of their answers. If you get stuck on who's who, I've included the names in order of all of the performers in the show notes. I was going to do each of their interviews separately, but it just felt better to have them all answering the question one after another, because I think it highlights all the differences in the way that they interacted with and interpreted my questions. I hope you enjoy.
My name is Kelly Coxon. I've been doing drag for 12 years, asterisk, because it's been almost a year since I've done an actual full drag show.
Hello, my name is Dan Davidson. My drag name is Sparkle Lee, and I've been doing drag for about 6 years now.
Hi, my name is Tara Sierra. I have been doing drag for 2.5 years, and I am super excited to be here with Janessa J. Champagne.
Hello, everyone. My name is Brendana Dupree-Larice, and I have been an entertainer for 16 years.
I'm known as Miss Gimme Pills and Liquor, and I'm 63 years old and known as North Dakota's oldest performing drag queen. I started at 40, so that makes me in my 23rd year as a performing drag queen.
Well, hello, everybody. My name is Azalea Iman. I've been doing drag for 4 years now.
Hi, my name's Prada Dior. I've been doing drag for about 8, 9 years now.
I'm Claire Storm, also known as the Hell Barbie. Yeah, I've been performing for a long time, for over 20 years.
So my name is Brooke Lane, and I've been doing drag for about 7 or 8 years now.
Hi, I'm Victoria Gotti, and I've been doing drag since 2002, so that would make 16 years.
I am Tequila Mockingbird. I have done drag for about 2 years now.
How would you name or describe your gender identity?
I struggle with this. I mean, I honestly feel like I'm a cis male in the fact that I feel confident that I like my boy parts and I identify with male more so than female.
So this, like many of your beautiful and amazing questions, is just so gloriously layered in a lot of ways for me. I'm kind of going through a lot of personal inventory on a lot of things in my life lately. I'm doing a lot of work with PFLAG and helping to support a lot of support groups, just spaces for conversation and dialogue for many, many diverse voices. All that is to say, through that, I've basically realized for me in my own journey, it is ever changing, it is ever evolving. To even be able to take a step back and kind of see that a little bit more globally has been helpful for me. But I would say I definitely exist on the genderqueer spectrum, but identify definitely a little bit more masculine. I identify as a gay man, use he, him pronouns, or they, them.
I would name my gender identity cisgender male.
My gender identity. Well, I do identify as trans woman. You know, I go by the pronouns of she. I mean, I don't know how you really say it, but I guess I still date men, so I guess it's kind of like straight in a way. Yes. I don't know which way you would really say it. I guess it depends on the person. Because I've met many different people who are like me, but they call themselves very different things. So I guess it depends on the person. So I consider myself a straight trans woman.
My gender identity, I am a gay male, and I present as a man and prefer he. Out of drag, I prefer he and him. In drag, I present as a woman and prefer she and her.
I'm very gender fluid. I identify as gender fluid, but more on like the female, feminine spectrum. I think the term is like femme butch or something like that, because I do still dress day to day as quote unquote male, but I still identify very feminine. I like being treated like a woman. My pronouns are she, her, or they, them, never he. But yeah, it's very fluid in the way where I can play with it still, but I do like to refer to it as feminine or she.
Very outgoing, kind of a diva at times. Basically just all around and, I don't know, outgoing, I guess.
Do you feel like you fall into more masculine, more feminine?
I fall in between both. I haven't picked a side yet.
Well, I'm basically an act. I'm a gay male, and then I transform into Claire Storm, which is a over-the-top Elvira type scream queen, femme fatale rock and roll vixen, so to speak. It's a character. I've been playing this character for, like I said, over 20 years. I started performing, right out of high school. Actually, I was still in high school, my senior year when I started performing, and I actually started out impersonating Madonna and Elvira, and it just went from there.
I guess I'm fairly gender fluid. I definitely know I'm male, but as far as like clothing, makeup, nails, all that goes, like I just like to be creative.
I identify as a full man. I'm all manly. I just like to dress up as a woman. So I would say I identify as this male, a gay male, that likes to dress up and have fun every now and then.
Growing up, there wasn't really a name for it. I guess it's non-binary these days. Because I never really felt on the scale of macho or feminine. So I never really fell on either one of those ends. I was always comfortable in mom's pumps and her, oversized t-shirts and doing shows for myself. It was always kind of in the middle somewhere, I guess.
Has your gender identity changed from when you started doing drag until now?
It has and hasn't. In my everyday life, I still honestly identify more so as male, but I will say that doing drag and exploring the more feminine side of who I am has really just kind of opened me up more so as a gay male, if that makes any sense.
Yes, I believe that everything is changing and evolving, and, that's kind of something that I think we all, realize is a thing that happens for everyone. Definitely, drag gave me a huge, huge appreciation for being a female and being a female-bodied person in the world, and just how that affects someone. And being a man that is doing art that is playing with gender and stuff like that. It also then just made me challenge a lot of things for myself as a man. I think it has radically affected my gender identity just because it's given me so much space to educate myself on a lot of things.
Not really. At the end of the night, I am super excited to pull off the pads and pull off the tights and scrape off my face and go to bed as a boy.
Drag helped me realize who I was. As a kid, I would always dress up in mama's gowns and things like that, when she would leave the house. And so growing up in a small town in North Carolina, I always knew I was a little different. Once I turned 18, I started going to the gay clubs. That's when I realized what gay was. For those next 4 years, drag really helped me realize that I was meant to be a woman, because I started noticing myself going out more and more to the club as a girl, even when I wasn't doing shows. As a boy, I was a very shy and gullible person, but when I would get in drag, I just felt so confident, and I felt like I could just take on the world. So actually, through drag helped me realize who I am today.
I don't believe that my gender has changed, although I feel that I am much more fluid and accepting of my gender now. And I've thought a lot more about gender presentation, my own and other people's gender identity and their issues and other people's issues with people's gender, especially within the last, I'd say, 4 or 5 years since gender has become a huge topic.
Oh, definitely. When I first started doing drag, I was literally I considered myself a boy in a wig. That was it. Wasn't really in depth with anything, but being in the drag community for 4 years now has really opened my eyes up how you're able to expand on your gender identity. So yeah, it's definitely changed since then.
I've definitely grown with makeup and being on stage and having that presence of the audience watching you and trying not to look a fool. Yeah, I guess you learn as you go and you learn new makeup tips and all that fun jazz.
I think I'm able to separate them more, and most people that meet me as Robert, which is my real name, well, very few people get to know Robert because I kind of keep my personal life personal, but I'm married, I have a husband. He's very supportive of what I do, but we keep Claire Storm, and Robert to do independent film as Robert, as an actor, play lots of other roles as well. But over the years, I think it's gotten easier to separate the two, most definitely. I try to, like I said, keep the two completely separate.
Oh, yeah. I went through a lot of questioning, a lot of wondering. I never really thought that I was trans prior to doing drag, but after I started doing drag, I very seriously questioned it and considered it. But I decided I was definitely male. Being female is way too much work.
Well, I can say, yeah, it has changed. Because when I first got into the game, I didn't really know what all I was getting myself into. And over the years, started to learn a little bit more and a little bit more. So now, I honestly say Victoria is her own identity. Calvin is his own identity. Calvin pays the bills. Victoria brings the party. That's the difference.
Such has unlocked this inner kind of diva bitch woman that I love. I love Tequila, that persona, and it's just it's changed my whole idea of expression and that it's okay to, get those lines a little bit blurred with gender. Kind of made me less uptight about everything.
How has performing in drag affected how you think about your own identity or gender more generally?
It's definitely opened me up. I know from doing shows, seeing people coming to the shows and creating a space where even though I'm dressed in drag and I'm performing, and I, as previously stated, feel more confident identifying myself as a cis male, even though I'm gay, having shows and performing and seeing people come dressed as how they feel comfortable and creating that space really has kind of given me kind of a different experience. I feel way more open, to explore different kinds of drag and different types of personas. But I also feel like it's opened up a whole new world to me of the fact that there are a lot more people out there that aren't necessarily one thing or the other.
Another glorious, juicy question. I'm doing a program called Jurassic Park, the Drag Show, and it's a reboot show from a production that I did with some friends called Glitter Beast, and it was done at the Unicorn Narwhal. So it's basically this contemporary vaudeville show that's just very kooky and very over the top and just veiny and out there. It's drag, but it's burlesque, but it's theater, but it's a comedy sketch, but we just cross a lot of barriers. We've just always been intentionally kind of messy, and there's a German movement called Dada. A lot of what we do kind of embraces a lot of things within this movement called Dada. Within the program of the Jurassic Park show, basically used as like a queer teen youth empowerment camp is basically what I've been building it towards. We're planning to do another production at the end of August, and I'm building it basically as this queer camp with these really cool workshops built in with local queer artists, performance artists, slam poets, just kind of really crossing a lot of boundaries as far as performance goes. And then hoping to produce the show. That's a little bit up in the air right now too as far as scheduling, but we're going for an all-age venue, and we're using half local artists and half queer teens. Basically, all this is to say that there's been a lot with the workshop planning, educational materials and stuff like that I've been thinking about for the teens kind of just relate a lot to this. So it's such a big, huge, amazing, wonderful issue that I'm just excited to continue exploring.
As far as my own identity, it's really kind of solidified it. So if there was ever any question as to whether or not I wanted to be a woman, that was answered. I am very content in my male form. As far as gender in general, it's opened my eyes a little bit. I come from a really small town here in North Dakota, and so growing up, I didn't have the opportunity to see what the world had to offer as far as different kinds of people and different kinds of genders. And I think as time goes on, we see more difference between people. Even what we know as trans has broadened as far as like a spectrum of different people, and it's become more inclusive, which is good.
It doesn't really, I guess it's different because I live as a woman. So when I get in drag, I don't really think about dressing up as a woman versus as to people who live their life as a boy during the day and then they dress up as a girl. So for me, more it's like when I'm in drag, I'm just being more of a character and a persona versus me saying that I'm, dressing up as a woman. But over time, I've had to realize, because it is hard being a full-time showgirl for the past 16 years. For a while, like, drag did kind of take over my life, and it was just drag. It was just Brendana for years and years. And over time, I've learned how to separate myself and have Kimberly, and then there's Brendana. So
I have always had some gender issues. Even as a tiny little kid, I was always very effeminate as a little boy and was called sissy and berated about it by my father and others in the family. I was embarrassed by that, and I was told when I came out at the age of 19, being effeminate in late 70s was looked down upon in the gay community. The first gay friends I had taught me to butch it up. and to dress more masculine, to present myself more masculine in order to be accepted better. Now, I don't care how people perceive me, and I'm more comfortable with myself, and especially since I started performing in drag and have become much more comfortable going back and forth between my usual male gender role and when I go in drag on stage as a woman. Makes me much happier. And when I do go in drag, it's a huge release to me and makes me happy.
It's made me focus more on my feminine side. I don't know if this is really a politically correct term, but there's always a difference between like a gay boy dancing in a wig and then a woman on stage. And that's how I was kind of brought up with drag, and to present yourself like a woman, because I kind of more identify as a female illusionist versus a drag queen. I like to paint more feminine. I like to paint softer. But when I do want to be like a drag queen and be painted up, there's a very clear difference on my like drag performance. But yeah, I think it really depends on the mood or the venue really. Places like the 90s, you want a drag queen, you want that painted back goddess, big hair, big proportions, so on and so forth. But if you're at like a smaller venue, they almost get angry when you look like a clown. So you put on the soft face, you will be a little more feminine, a little more flirty. I feel like the performing really tweaked it a lot coming with the years of drag.
I guess I do it for entertaining the audience. I would never want to be a woman. I guess I just do it for the entertainment part.
It makes you really understand, especially more so when I perform with the band. We're always booked at straight rock and roll venues, and we perform for all different types of crowds, even like biker type crowds. It makes you really understand what women go through, the way guys hit on you and stuff. A lot of times they don't know, and sometimes they do know, but they're just super intrigued by it. Know what it's like to be put in a woman's shoes, so to speak. I don't really feel like people perceive me as a woman most of the time. I think they know I'm a drag queen usually because I'm so over the top most of the time. It's a lot of work.
Drag has given me a hell of a lot more confidence. Mostly just the confidence. It's taught me to be comfortable in my own skin, being able to step out of yourself and form not only as a different character, but as an entirely different gender is a very freeing and opening up experience. It really helped me come out of my shell and be more comfortable with who I was as a man out of drag.
Okay, so if I'm Victoria, I'm usually, a little more happier, a little more party, let's go have fun. When I'm Calvin, it's more down to business. So I have learned to kind of incorporate Victoria with Calvin. So Calvin can go out and do the same thing. Calvin's the party now, but he wasn't when I first started. It took a while to get there, but I did.
It's more general. I used to be very judgmental, and if I would see a man in heels in public, think to myself, that's kind of weird. But now that I'm in heels a lot in my apartment doing numbers, for my shows, it's just kind of unlocked that piece of my brain that was so focused on gender that it's just really opened me up to a whole new world that I don't even think about it anymore, really.
Is there anything related to gender identity or expression that you want people to think about or engage with when they see you perform?
I'm not the first one to say it. Plenty of people online, on Facebook, and YouTube videos out there have said it. I am not what you would classify as a pretty drag queen. I mean, I have my moments. I can paint my face. I can spend the money to buy certain outfits and wigs and whatnot. But for the most part, I'm still dealt with a very prominent male featured face and a Jay Leno chin. So you get what you get when it comes to me. Each performer has their own unique thing that they do. They have their own special talents, their own abilities. And for me, I don't spend a whole lot of time worrying about the look and whether or not I pass as female, because that's never been important to me. The importance to me is that I'm doing something, I am creating a persona, and I'm putting on a good show.
I think a big one for this and just in general, I think is just respect. Everyone really radically redefining what that means to them and to other people and how that might be different, because I know what affects a lot of performers a lot of times. Drag is 1,000 things to 1,000 different people, and you know, that's what's so exciting about a drag show, and especially local drag shows are just so exciting because it's like you don't know who's coming out sometimes. You don't know how long this person has been doing it, and that doesn't even matter. It's just so cool to see how many different things drag can be to so many different people.
When you see me on stage, I want you to think about, is this what a woman should look like? My drag is kind of fishy, a little bit less clown than I thought it would end up being. I feel like when people go to a drag show, they've already left their notions of gender at the door because, let's be honest, we're not actual real women on stage. And our audience members, they should have a sense of that. There's a certain level of willing suspension of disbelief that should happen when an audience member walks through the doors and takes a seat. When I started doing drag, I was sitting on my couch just bitching and moaning because I had to paint my nails and I had to put on a lip and I had to put on eyeliner. And I said the words, why do we make women do this? What is it about all of this that makes a woman beautiful? In my mind, it doesn't need to be that way. You don't have to put on 4 pounds of makeup to be pretty. And if you look at me on stage and you say, he put a lot of work into that, that's good enough for me.
Especially with the gay 90s, how we're such an all-inclusive club. You know, for me, I just want people to realize that when you see people on stage, they're not all just boys and drag, and they're not all just girls in drag, because a lot of people still don't know about transsexuals and transgender male or females, and a lot of people don't know that there's also biological men and women that perform too. For me, when I'm performing and emceeing and stuff, you know, I try to help people understand drag has changed so much and it's grown so much and it's evolved and spread out through different varieties and divisions of people. I try to teach people that all sexualities, all genders and things are always on stage and they can be all kinds of performing and stuff.
The only thing that I like for the audience to think about is having a good time and enjoying the performance and thinking, wow, she looks great for an old man.
There's tons of drag queens who are very political and gender political when it comes to performance art. Me, however, I'm just here to entertain for you. I just want to dance. I just want to make you feel something for a good 3 minutes and 20 seconds. I'm just like a classically brought up drag queen. I just want to come, perform, do my thing, and then get off the stage.
I would just say interact and have fun, I guess.
That's a hard question. I like people to think about, as far as drag goes, that lately it's become, especially in my type of drag, I'm more horror influenced than rock and roll influenced, which is kind of a dying breed, and at least where I'm from, here in Georgia, people want to see RuPaul Drag Race drag queens. You know, even though I have auditioned twice, I get told I'm way too horror and too bizarre for that type of show. Then I'm not filthy enough. I'm too glamorous to be on Dragula. I like people to remember that a lot of queens, especially ones like me, that's been in the business for over 20 years, we worked hard to pave the way for the newer generation of drag. It's nice to see newer queens respecting the older queens. I like people to think about how much work it takes to get in drag if they come out to a show. The duct tape, the hair, the makeup, it's time consuming, and it's nice to be appreciated, I guess. And be respectful just because we're dressed up or if we're sexy, you know, just like real women, be respectful.
It is okay to be, feel, see, and love whoever the hell you want to. And don't let anyone ever make you feel ashamed for following what your heart and your head want. I always like to try and educate people. A lot of people don't realize that there's a difference between drag queens, transgendered people, and cross-dressers. People are very shocked when, you know, they say, well, you're a cross-dresser, and I respond, no, I'm not a cross-dresser. I am a drag queen. There's a big difference. And a lot of people are very appreciative because they don't realize.
When I started this, I was a bisexual male covered in, not knowing anything. Took me years to perform or perfect my craft. So when you do see me, just know I'm giving you all I got. This is the best that I got. And as far as makeup, costumes, everything, I want everything to be right. So when you do see a show of mine, you know, that's Victoria Gotti.
I put on a character, and I want people to get into that. I like to kind of be flirty, and I like to kind of touch people and be touched. You know, I'm kind of a party girl, so I like to get down with the crowd and the audience. Get into it, you know, like it's okay. If I'm coming toward you sexually or seductively, you know, it's okay to say I'm that. I'm a whole lot of woman when I'm in drag. There's a lot of curves to look at, a lot of things to do, so it's okay to be flirty back with me.
Now, before we sign off from this very special episode, I'd like to end with one more piece of the interview I did with Gimme Pills and Liquor. There was something that she talked about from her experience as a bartender in the 1970s that I felt was really touching and very poignant. And I think that a lot of us, regardless of what our gender identity is or our sexual orientation, a lot of us carry around a lot of pain from our past. And part of that comes from the people who caused that pain. And when you're trying to heal yourself, when you're trying to move on, you can decide whether or not to forgive or forget. But at some point, I think it's very important for you to focus on your own growth, on letting yourself let go of some of those negative experiences and move into the best version of you that you can become. One more time, here's Gimme Pills and Liquor.
Back when I first came out in the late 70s and early 80s, drag queens and people that were transgender were really looked down upon by a lot of the gay community, and society in general. And I reflected that a lot. And I was actually forced to. I was a young gay bartender from about 1975 to 78. And I worked in 2 bars, actually, where we were not allowed to serve men in drag or lesbians. And we had to politely say, I'm sorry, but we can't serve you. And it just hurt my soul to do that because that's not me and never has been me. And I've always had friends who were drag queens, and I've had transsexual friends. I made my first transsexual friend when I first came out at 19 in 1975. So those kind of things always hurt me, but to live life, those were the kind of things you had to deal with back then. Of course, when I became a drag queen myself, I got a taste of my own medicine, and I realized how hurtful it was. And it happened to me a few times. Well, more than a few. I've rethought things, and I'm much more accepting, and I've become a lot more comfortable with all kinds of people. I learned you don't judge people no matter who they are, how they look. I've become a much more accepting and whole person, I believe.
I just want to say thank you so much to the wonderful performers who shared their stories with me. Kelly Coxon, Sparkle Lee, Cara Fiera, Brandana Dupree-Larice, Gimme Pills and Liquor, Azalea Iman, Prada Dior, Claire Storm, Brooke Lane, Victoria Gotti, and Tequila Mockingbird. I really appreciated the honesty and the candor and the way that they approached these questions really thoughtfully. Now, it's important to remember that these are just 11 stories. And everybody on this podcast, myself included, can only really represent their perspective. But that's what I wanted. I wanted a bunch of different people bringing their different perspectives together and just let people hear it. And if something resonates with you, I think that's great. And if something doesn't resonate with you, maybe that means that it's time for you to tell your story. All right, well, I hope you've enjoyed this very special episode of Janessa After Dark. Go ahead and leave us a comment and let us know what other kinds of topics you'd like us to tackle. And don't forget to look us up on SoundCloud, iTunes, and Stitcher to catch all of our great interviews and fascinating commentary. And with that, we'll now return you to your regularly scheduled program. This very special episode of Janessa After Dark includes royalty-free music from bensound.com, including the tracks Actionable, which serves as our podcast intro, Memories, which played against the first part of the commentary, and Happiness, which played before and after the interview segments. For these great royalty-free tracks and more, visit bensound, that's BEN sound.com. Janessa After Dark is written and directed by Chris M. Stoner and is a Champagne Dreams production.